Imagine you are the most powerful military force on the planet. Your armies have torn through 6 countries in under 2 years. Your generals are celebrated as geniuses. Your soldiers believe they are invincible. Your leader believes he is chosen by destiny itself. And then, in a single season, through nothing but arrogance, impatience, and a catastrophic refusal to listen to the men who knew better, you throw it all away. That is not a story about bad luck. That is not a story about being outgunned. That is a story about a machine so convinced of its own perfection that it never saw the wall it was driving straight into at full speed. By the winter of 1941, Germany had already committed the mistake that would eventually kill it. Not on any battlefield. Not in any specific battle. The killing blow was struck in the minds of the men at the very top, months before the consequences became visible. And here is the thing that will haunt you as you listen to this. The men who could have stopped it knew exactly what was coming. They said so. They wrote it down. They begged. And they were ignored. This is the story of Germany's overconfidence. The story of how the most formidable military machine the modern world had ever seen looked at its own success, mistook momentum for invincibility, and set itself on a course toward destruction so complete, so total, that 70 years later historians are still arguing about exactly when the moment of no return truly passed. Buckle in. Because this story moves fast, and it hits hard. To understand how Germany fell into the trap of overconfidence, you first have to understand just how staggering its early victories actually were. Because without that context, the arrogance doesn't make sense. With it, it becomes almost understandable. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within 27 days, the Polish military, a force of over 1 million men, was effectively broken. Yes, the Soviet Union stabbed Poland in the back from the east. Yes, the Polish Air Force was massively outmatched. But nothing fully explains the speed of that collapse to someone who wasn't watching it happen in real time. Military analysts around the world were genuinely stunned. The Wehrmacht, the German military machine, had not simply won. It had won in a way that rewrote the textbook. The concept they demonstrated was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It wasn't entirely new in theory, but Germany executed it at a scale and speed nobody had witnessed before. Tanks did not sit in defensive lines waiting for infantry. They punched through the enemy's weakest points at terrifying speed, raced deep behind the front lines, and collapsed the enemy's ability to respond before the enemy even understood what was happening. Communication networks were destroyed. Supply lines were cut. Commanders at the front couldn't reach commanders in the rear. And soldiers who were supposed to be fighting a coordinated defense suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off, and fighting blind. The psychological effect of this cannot be overstated. Blitzkrieg did not just destroy armies physically. It destroyed them mentally. By the time Polish commanders understood what was happening to them, it was already too late to adapt. The speed was the weapon. And then Germany did it again. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway simultaneously. Denmark fell in 6 hours. 6 hours! Norway took slightly longer, but within weeks it too was under German control, despite the involvement of British and French forces who had rushed to assist. That was the part that really shook the Allied High Command. Germany hadn't just beaten Poland, a country with a partially modernized military. It had beaten an Allied intervention in Scandinavia while planning its next move simultaneously. That next move came in May 1940, and it became arguably the most shocking military achievement of the entire 20th century. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all invaded simultaneously on May 10, 1940. France alone had spent the entire previous winter building up what it believed was an impenetrable defensive posture. It had the Maginot Line, a massive fortification system along the Franco-German border that represented the absolute pinnacle of defensive military engineering. It had a military that on paper matched Germany's nearly man for man. It had British allies fighting alongside it. Military experts looking at the balance of forces genuinely believed France could hold. Some believed France would win. France fell in 46 days. 46 days. One of the great powers of Europe, the nation that had bled Germany dry for 4 years in the First World War, the country with the most experienced defensive military doctrine on the continent, was brought to its knees in less than 7 weeks. When Germany entered Paris on June 14, 1940, something changed in the mind of Adolf Hitler. Something hardened. Something that had previously been ambition fused with cold political calculation began to curdle into something more dangerous, genuine, unshakable belief in his own infallibility. And that belief was going to cost Germany everything. To understand what happened next, you have to spend a moment inside Hitler's worldview in the summer of 1940, because it is genuinely one of the most fascinating and terrifying case studies in the psychology of power ever recorded. Hitler had not been a professional soldier. He had been a corporal in the First World War, a brave one, but a corporal nonetheless. He had no formal military training. He had no education in strategy beyond what he taught himself through obsessive reading. When he first began overruling his generals in the late 1930s, the German officer corps was horrified. These were men who had studied warfare their entire professional lives. They had attended the finest military academies in the world. They had spent decades studying Napoleon, Clausewitz, Schlieffen. And here was this former house painter, this failed artist turned political firebrand, telling them he knew better. The problem, the deeply, catastrophically inconvenient problem, was that in the early years, Hitler kept being right. When he ordered the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, his generals warned him the French army would crush them. France did nothing. When he pushed for the annexation of Austria in 1938, his generals worried. Austria folded without a shot. When he demanded the Sudetenland, his generals actually planned a coup to remove him, so certain were they that his recklessness would bring a catastrophic war. He got the Sudetenland at a negotiating table, and the coup plan evaporated. When he invaded Poland and his generals fretted about France and Britain intervening in force, they fell apart within weeks. Every time the generals said slow down, Hitler charged ahead. Every time they said it's too risky, it worked. Do you see the trap? Do you see how this happens? Because after enough repetitions, the rational human mind begins to draw a conclusion. The conclusion is, maybe he really does know something the rest of us don't. And that conclusion was now infecting not just Hitler himself, but the entire German high command. Generals who had privately thought the man was dangerously reckless were quietly revising their assessment. Maybe his instincts were genuinely extraordinary. Maybe there was something almost supernatural in his ability to read the moment. The victories were real. The results were undeniable. History seemed to be vindicating him at every turn. This is where overconfidence stops being a personality flaw and becomes a systemic military problem. Because when an entire command structure begins to believe that past success guarantees future success, it stops doing the careful analytical work that produced those past successes in the first place. It stops asking hard questions. It stops running worst-case scenarios seriously. It stops listening to the people who are raising uncomfortable possibilities, because those people start to seem like cowards and defeatists rather than serious analysts. By the summer of 1940, that is exactly where Germany's military leadership was. And the next decision was going to be the one that decided everything. Britain had not surrendered. This was a problem that Hitler genuinely did not seem to have fully planned for. His political instincts told him that after France fell, Britain's position was hopeless and its government would come to terms. He even held back German forces at Dunkirk in late May 1940, in a decision still debated by historians to this day, when he could have potentially annihilated the British expeditionary force on the beaches. Some historians believe he was deliberately leaving Britain a way out of the war with its dignity somewhat intact, hoping a negotiated peace would follow. It did not follow. Churchill stood at the dispatch box and told the German Reich and the listening world that Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, that it would never surrender. And he meant it. So Germany faced a choice. It could launch a cross-channel invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, a massive, logistically nightmarish amphibious assault against an island nation that would require air superiority Germany didn't have, naval superiority Britain would contest, and the kind of combined arms coordination at sea that the Wehrmacht had never needed to develop. Germany was a land power. It had spent the last decade perfecting the art of fighting on land. The English Channel was 21 miles of water that might as well have been the Pacific Ocean given Germany's maritime limitations. The Luftwaffe attempted to win the air war over Britain in the summer and fall of 1940. The Battle of Britain was fierce, sustained, and for a terrifying period looked like it might actually succeed. German bombers struck British airfields with methodical ferocity. RAF Fighter Command was being ground down. Its reserves were thinning. Pilots were exhausted. Aircraft production was struggling to keep pace with losses. And then Germany blinked. In late August 1940, after a small British bombing raid on Berlin, more symbolic than destructive, but deeply insulting to Hitler personally, Germany switched its bombing campaign away from the RAF airfields and toward British cities. The Blitz. The bombing of London, of Coventry, of Liverpool and other industrial centers. Strategically, this was the moment the Battle of Britain turned. By shifting to civilian targets, Germany gave the RAF exactly the breathing room it needed to rebuild and regroup. The British air defense system survived. Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. Germany had not conquered Britain. It was stuck. Strategically stalled for the first time in the war. And in that stall, Hitler made the decision that would define the entire conflict. He turned east. Operation Barbarossa. 3 words that have echoed through military history with a weight that is hard to fully convey. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, was the largest military operation in the history of human warfare. Over 3 million German soldiers. Nearly 3,500 tanks. More than 2,700 aircraft. Attacking along a front that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, a front nearly 1,800 miles long. To put that in perspective, if you drove at highway speed without stopping, it would take you over 25 hours just to drive the length of the front line. The scale was unprecedented. The ambition was staggering. And the timeline Hitler gave his generals for achieving total victory was 3 to 4 months. 3 to 4 months to conquer a country that was larger than the entire North American continent. Here is where you have to pause, because there is something psychologically remarkable happening in the German High Command at this moment. Some of Germany's finest military minds genuinely believed it was possible. Not because they were stupid, these were some of the most rigorously trained staff officers in the world. But because of the momentum. Because of the record. Because 6 countries had fallen, and France had fallen, and everything they had been told was impossible had turned out to be possible. That is what overconfidence does to brilliant people. It doesn't make them stupid. It makes them stop asking the questions that might reveal inconvenient truths. But some men did ask those questions. And what they found should have stopped everything. General George Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armaments Office, ran the logistics numbers for Barbarossa and came back with findings that were deeply alarming. The supply chain requirements for sustaining 3 army groups across that distance and for that duration were beyond Germany's current logistical capacity. The rail gauge in the Soviet Union was different from the European standard. Every rail line would need to be converted as the army advanced, a massive engineering undertaking that would slow supply dramatically. German fuel production and stockpiles were insufficient for a prolonged campaign. The entire operation was premised on the Soviet military collapsing quickly, because if it didn't, the German advance would literally run out of fuel and ammunition before it reached its objectives. Thomas submitted his analysis. It was noted. It was not acted upon. General Friedrich Paulus, the same Paulus who would later surrender at Stalingrad, ran a war game simulating Barbarossa before the invasion was launched. The simulation concluded that German forces would outrun their supply lines and be forced to halt before reaching their key objectives. The simulation's findings were uncomfortable. They were also, as it turned out, almost precisely accurate. But in the summer of 1941, in the first intoxicating weeks of Barbarossa, none of that seemed to matter. Because the initial results were so spectacular, they seemed to confirm everything the optimists had promised. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, Germany achieved something that seemed almost physically impossible. The Red Army, caught in a state of genuine unpreparedness despite multiple intelligence warnings, was shattered. Stalin had refused to believe the invasion was coming right up until German shells began falling on Soviet positions. His paranoid purges of the late 1930s had gutted the Red Army Officer Corps, 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders had been executed or imprisoned. The Soviet military in June 1941 was led predominantly by men who had been rapidly promoted to fill dead men's shoes, men who hadn't yet developed the confidence or the institutional knowledge to respond effectively to the German assault. The results were catastrophic. At Minsk, Germany encircled and captured over 300,000 Soviet soldiers in less than 2 weeks. At Smolensk, Another encirclement netted over 300,000 more. At Kiev in September 1941, in what was at that point the largest encirclement in military history, Germany captured more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers. 600,000 men in a single battle. The city that Churchill had called the greatest land battle of the war, and Germany had won it. By October 1941, Germany's Army Group Center launched Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow. Two massive encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk added another 600,000 Soviet prisoners. By mid-October, the road to Moscow seemed open. The Soviet government evacuated eastward. Stalin himself briefly considered leaving the capital. Panic swept through the city. Moscow's defenders were desperately throwing together a defense from militia units, rear echelon troops, and whatever fresh divisions could be rushed west from Siberia. From the outside, from the perspective of a German officer examining a map in October 1941, the Soviet Union looked finished. More than 3 million prisoners taken. Enormous swaths of territory captured. The Soviet military appeared to be disintegrating. The numbers were unlike anything in the history of warfare. And that is precisely where the trap closed. There is a concept in military strategy called the culminating point. It's the moment in any offensive operation when the attacking force has stretched itself to the absolute limit of its capacity. Its supply lines are extended, its men are exhausted, its equipment is worn down, and the momentum that seemed unstoppable is actually on the verge of collapse. Beyond the culminating point, further advance doesn't bring victory closer. It brings disaster closer. Germany hit its culminating point in the autumn of 1941, and the men who were supposed to be watching for exactly this moment missed it entirely because they were too busy looking at the map and counting the incredible distances they had already advanced. The logistical warnings that had been dismissed before the invasion were now manifesting in brutal reality. German supply trucks were wearing out at a catastrophic rate on Soviet roads, dirt tracks that turned to impassable mud bogs in the autumn rains, a meteorological phenomenon the Germans called Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The different rail gauge problem was exactly as severe as Thomas had predicted. Ammunition stocks were running dangerously low. Tanks that had begun the campaign in peak operational condition were now operating at a fraction of their strength. Many units were down to 30 or 40% of their authorized tank strength, the rest broken down, worn out, or destroyed. And then came the cold. The German army in the winter of 1941 was not equipped for Russian winter. This is perhaps the most famous example of German overconfidence in the entire war, and it was not an accident or a supply failure or bad planning. It was a deliberate decision based on the prediction that the Soviet Union would be defeated before winter arrived. Why issue winter equipment when the campaign will be over in October? Why carry the logistical burden of millions of sets of winter clothing, special lubricants for weapons in extreme cold, insulated boots, winter-grade fuel, heating equipment, all of it weighing down a supply chain that was already buckling? If the campaign is over in October, you don't need winter gear. That calculation made complete logical sense inside the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse on schedule. The Soviet Union did not collapse on schedule. By November and December 1941, German soldiers were fighting in temperatures that reached -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Men's rifles froze. Tank engines wouldn't start. Frostbite casualties began appearing in numbers that dwarfed combat casualties in some units. Soldiers were wrapping newspaper inside their boots. They were burning furniture to stay alive. They were dying not from bullets but from cold. Army Group Center's advance on Moscow ground to a halt not because of Soviet military resistance, though that was stiffening dramatically, but because the men at the very tip of the German advance were physically incapable of continuing. They were frozen. They were starving. They were exhausted beyond the point of effective military function. And they were 20 miles from Moscow. 20 miles. The German advance had covered over 1,000 miles. It stopped 20 miles short of its ultimate objective because the assumptions it was built on had been wrong. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. The timing was not coincidental. Stalin's intelligence from his spy network in Japan had confirmed that Japan was planning to attack the United States rather than the Soviet Far East, and he had moved dozens of fresh, winter-trained Siberian divisions west. These were men who knew how to fight in cold that was killing German soldiers. These were divisions that had been kept secret from German intelligence, carefully concealed until the moment of maximum effect. The German front around Moscow cracked. In some places it shattered. Entire German units found themselves cut off, racing to escape encirclement, abandoning equipment that in the brutal cold simply could not be moved. Generals who had been writing triumphant operational reports weeks earlier were now begging for permission to retreat. Hitler refused. His response to the crisis of December 1941 was to issue his infamous Stand Fast order. No retreat. No withdrawal to shorten and consolidate the front. Every man holds his position. Anyone who orders a retreat will face a court-martial. And here is the historically ironic thing. His decision may actually have prevented an even worse catastrophe in the short term. The German front around Moscow, though battered and pushed back, did not collapse entirely. Unlike the French in 1940, the German soldier dug in and held on through sheer willpower. But the price of that holding was a strategic reality that could no longer be denied. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. The war in the East was not going to be a 3 to 4 month campaign. It was going to be a prolonged, grinding war of attrition against a country with enormous territory, enormous resources, and a population that was demonstrating a capacity for endurance that should not have surprised anyone who had read Russian military history, but somehow had not been seriously incorporated into German planning. Germany now faced exactly what its greatest strategic thinkers had warned against for generations: a two-front war. Britain to the west, the Soviet Union to the east. The nightmare of German strategic theory made real. And Hitler's response to this reality was not to reassess, not to recalibrate, not to begin the serious strategic rethinking that the situation demanded. His response was to double down. 1942 is in some ways the most fascinating year of the European war, because it is the year when Germany's remaining strategic options were still real but rapidly narrowing, and the choices made that year demonstrate overconfidence operating at an almost philosophical level. The German summer offensive of 1942, Case Blue, was predicated on a genuine strategic insight. Germany desperately needed oil. Its fuel situation was severe enough that sustaining major offensive operations indefinitely was genuinely impossible without new sources. The Caucasus oil fields, if captured, would both fuel Germany's military and deny that fuel to the Soviet Union. That was sound strategic logic. What was not sound was the execution. Case Blue was originally intended to be a focused, sequential operation: advance to the Don River, secure the flanks, then push into the Caucasus. But as the operation unfolded and initial progress looked promising, Hitler began expanding the objectives. Simultaneously, he wanted Army Group A to push deep into the Caucasus toward Baku's oil fields, while Army Group B advanced toward the Volga River to cut Soviet supply lines. Simultaneously, with the forces available. His generals protested. You could not drive two massive army groups in diverging directions simultaneously without fatally weakening both. The flanks would be dangerously exposed. The Soviets, who were now fighting far more skillfully than they had in 1941, learning with terrifying speed from their catastrophic defeats, would find those exposed flanks. Hitler dismissed the protests. The Soviets, he was certain, were finished as a serious military force. The losses they had sustained in 1941, over 4 million men killed, captured, or wounded, were in his view simply unsurvivable for any military organization. They were running on fumes. One more serious push would finish them. The city on the Volga that would become the turning point of the entire war was a secondary objective in the original plan. An industrial city, useful for its factories and its symbolic value given that it bore Stalin's name, but not the primary target. The primary target was the oil. Stalingrad was supposed to be secured on the way to the real objective, its capture a matter of days. And then something happened that exposed every single fault line running through German strategic thinking. Stalingrad should have fallen. Looking at the military balance in late August 1942, when the German Sixth Army reached the city, there was every rational reason to expect it would fall quickly. The German forces committed to the battle were experienced, well-equipped, and fighting with all the operational momentum of a successful summer offensive. The Soviet defenders were outnumbered, partially surrounded, and fighting with their backs to the Volga River. There was nowhere to retreat. The opposite bank was under constant German artillery fire. The Soviet 62nd Army, defending the city under the command of General Vasily Chukov, did something that changed the nature of the battle entirely. They moved the front line so close to the German positions that German air power, the Luftwaffe's devastating Stuka dive bombers, The carpet bombing that had been so decisive in the open country became almost unusable. You cannot bomb positions that are entangled with your own soldiers. You cannot call in airstrikes when the enemy is 20 meters away from your own front line. The Soviets turned Stalingrad into a nightmare of close-quarters urban combat, a hellscape of ruined buildings and cellars and sewers and factory floors, where every floor of every building was a battleground, where a sniper could rule an entire city block, where a machine gun nest in a basement could hold off a company for days. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And while the German Sixth Army was being sucked deeper and deeper into this urban meat grinder, focused on the city, consumed by the city, the flanks were left exposed. The flanks were held not by German forces but by Romanian and Italian and Hungarian allies, troops that were poorly equipped for the Soviet winter, less experienced than their German counterparts, and stretched thin across enormous distances. German commanders on the ground saw the danger. They submitted reports. They requested reserves. They warned that a major Soviet offensive against those flanks would be catastrophic. The warnings reached Hitler. He did not send adequate reinforcements. He was certain the Soviets lacked the capacity to launch a major offensive. He was certain the city would fall in days. On November 19, 1942, 1 million Soviet soldiers launched Operation Uranus. In 2 days, the operation was complete. The German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was surrounded, cut off, encircled in the very city they had been trying to capture. The most powerful army in the world found itself trapped in a frozen ruin on the Volga, and everything that followed was a consequence of the overconfidence that had put it there. Hitler's response to the encirclement of Stalingrad is one of the most studied examples of catastrophically bad decision-making in military history, and it is catastrophically bad in a very specific way. It's not stupid. It's overconfident. There is a difference. A stupid decision-maker doesn't understand the situation. An overconfident one understands parts of it, but is so certain of his own ability to bend reality to his will that he refuses to accept the limits of what is achievable. Hitler had 2 choices after the encirclement was complete. He could order the Sixth Army to break out, fight their way through the Soviet encirclement while it was still relatively thin, and link up with German forces to the west. The breakout option was risky and would require abandoning enormous quantities of equipment, but military experts who have studied the situation believe it was viable in late November and early December 1942. Many lives would have been saved. Or he could hold. Keep the Sixth Army in place. Supply it by air while a relief force fought its way through to relieve the encirclement. Hitler chose to hold, for reasons that make a certain kind of internal sense if you accept his distorted view of reality. First, he had declared Stalingrad a fortress that would not fall. Retreating from it would be an enormous propaganda defeat and would shake the confidence of Germany's allies. Second, he genuinely believed, because Hermann Göring assured him, that the Luftwaffe could supply 300,000 men from the air. Third, he believed that General Erich von Manstein's relief force, driving from the southwest, would break through and relieve the city. Every single one of those beliefs was wrong. The Luftwaffe could not supply 300,000 men from the air. The mathematical reality was brutal. Stalingrad's garrison needed at least 700 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. The maximum the Luftwaffe ever managed to deliver in a single day was around 300 tons. Most days it was far less. Men were starving. Ammunition was running out. Horses were being slaughtered for food. Soldiers were eating leather. Manstein's relief force came within 40 miles of the Stalingrad perimeter before Soviet counterattacks stopped it cold and threatened to encircle the relief force itself. Manstein pulled back. The relief never came. And through all of this, Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. Even when breakout was still possible. Even when his best generals told him it was the only rational option. He told the Sixth Army to hold. He told them help was coming. He told them that Germany was watching, that history was watching, that they were the great anchor around which the entire Eastern Front would stabilize. They held. They died holding. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the German Sixth Army, 91,000 starving, frostbitten, diseased survivors out of 300,000, surrendered at Stalingrad. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the same Paulus who had run the war games before Barbarossa and predicted exactly this kind of disaster, was among them. The German public, which had been told for months that Stalingrad was on the verge of victory, was informed of the defeat in a special radio broadcast. A national period of mourning was declared. Something in the German national psychology shifted. The sense that the war was going well, that Germany's victory was inevitable, that the Führer's genius was infallible, it fractured. Not completely. Not immediately. But the crack was real. What followed Stalingrad tells you everything you need to know about what overconfidence costs in the long run. Germany was not finished after Stalingrad. Let's be honest about that. The Wehrmacht was still an extraordinarily formidable military force. Skilled German commanders like Manstein demonstrated in the months after Stalingrad that the German military could still operate brilliantly on the defensive and even launch devastating counterstrokes. The German army would fight effectively for 2 more years. But the strategic initiative, that precious, irreplaceable capacity to choose when and where to fight on your own terms, was gone. Germany had spent it. The incredible advantage it had built through brilliant early victories, through the element of surprise, through the innovative application of blitzkrieg, through the psychological shock of those staggering early successes, all of that had been spent chasing objectives in the Soviet Union that the logistical reality of the situation had made unreachable from the moment the snow began to fall. In July 1943, Germany launched its last major offensive on the Eastern Front, Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk. It was an assault against a Soviet defensive position that had been prepared for months, that bristled with 8 layers of defenses, that contained more mines per square meter than any defensive position in history. German intelligence knew the Soviets were prepared. German armored commanders warned that attacking into this position was folly. Several argued forcefully for a defensive strategy. Let the Soviets exhaust themselves attacking German positions, then strike their weakened forces with concentrated armor. Hitler ordered the offensive anyway. The result was the largest tank battle in history, and Germany lost it. Not catastrophically in terms of immediate losses, but decisively in terms of what happened next. The Soviets launched their own counteroffensive immediately after Citadel ended, and from that moment in the summer of 1943 until the fall of Berlin in May 1945, Germany never regained the strategic initiative. It retreated. Sometimes in good order. Sometimes en route. But always west. Always back toward Berlin. The distance from Stalingrad to Berlin is roughly 1,800 miles. It took the Red Army 2.5 years to cover that distance. But the direction never changed after January 1943. Never. Not once. There is a question that history keeps asking about Germany's Eastern campaign, and it deserves a real answer. Could it have been different? Not in the moral sense. The war of annihilation Germany waged in the East was a crime of staggering proportions, and the world is better for its defeat. But in the purely strategic, analytical sense, were the eventual outcomes determined from the start, or were there real moments where different decisions could have changed the trajectory? The uncomfortable answer is yes. There were moments. Several of them. If Germany had launched Barbarossa 6 weeks earlier, in early May instead of late June, it would have had 6 weeks more campaigning weather before the autumn rains and winter freeze intervened. 6 weeks might have been enough to capture Moscow before the Soviet defensive reorganization could solidify. Historians still debate what the fall of Moscow would have meant. Probably not an immediate Soviet collapse, but it would have been a serious blow to Soviet logistics and a devastating psychological shock. Why didn't Germany launch in May? Because it had to divert forces south to bail out Mussolini's failed campaign in Greece and Yugoslavia, delaying Barbarossa by almost 6 weeks. An overconfident ally creating problems that consumed the irreplaceable gift of campaigning time. If Germany had maintained its bombing campaign against RAF airfields in the autumn of 1940 instead of switching to British cities, the Battle of Britain might have had a different outcome, and Germany might have been in a position to at least threaten an invasion that kept Britain more cautious and defensive. If the German army had been issued winter equipment for the Eastern campaign, if someone in the supply chain had had the courage to insist on worst-case planning rather than optimistic planning, the catastrophe of the winter of 1941 might have been survivable without the enormous casualties that depleted Germany's best-trained frontline troops. If, at Stalingrad, Hitler had authorized the breakout when it was still viable, 200,000 experienced German soldiers would have survived to fight another day, and the Eastern Front in 1943 would have looked very different. Each of these moments was a consequence of the same fundamental failure, the refusal to plan for outcomes that contradicted the confident predictions at the top. And that refusal was not a random accident or a personality quirk. It was the logical, inevitable product of a command structure that had spent 2 years being told, and believing that it could not fail. There is a word the ancient Greeks used for the specific kind of overconfidence that brings down great men and great powers: hubris. They considered it not just a character flaw but a kind of cosmic offense, the arrogance of believing yourself exempt from the constraints that govern everyone else. And in their stories, hubris was always followed by nemesis, the inevitable correction, the force that restores balance. Germany's nemesis was not the Soviet Union. It was not the United States. It was not the strategic bombing campaign. Those were the instruments. The actual nemesis was internal. It was the moment, repeated over and over throughout the war, when the men who knew the hard truth looked at the confident assumptions of their leadership and chose to go along rather than fight for what they knew was right. It was General Thomas, who ran the logistics numbers before Barbarossa and found them wanting, and whose warnings were noted and dismissed. It was the armored commanders before Kursk who knew that attacking a prepared defense of that depth was folly, and who were overruled. It was the hundreds of officers throughout the campaign who wrote honest reports that were reframed, softened, or simply ignored as they made their way up the chain of command to men who only wanted confirmation of what they already believed. The military machine that had seemed unstoppable in 1940 was not defeated primarily by superior Allied strategy, though that certainly played a role later in the war. It was undermined from within by the same overconfidence that had built it to its peak. The momentum that had carried it forward across 6 countries turned into an anchor pulling it down. The lessons do not stay in 1945. They never do. History does not repeat itself, as the saying goes, but it rhymes with a precision that should make every student of the past deeply uncomfortable. Overconfidence is not a German military phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon. It is what happens when success is interpreted as proof of permanent superiority rather than evidence of specific advantages in specific circumstances. It is what happens when the people who ask hard questions are sidelined in favor of the people who provide comfortable answers. It is what happens when the institutional memory of failure, which is the single most valuable thing any organization can possess, is dismissed as defeatism. The German military of 1941 was not stupid. It was not incompetent. It was brilliant in many ways that we are still studying and learning from. But it had been so successful for so long that it had lost the habit of seriously imagining its own failure. And when you lose the habit of imagining failure, you lose the ability to prevent it. The Sixth Army froze to death 20 miles from Moscow and starved to death in Stalingrad not because Germany lacked good soldiers or skilled commanders. It froze and starved because the men who could have prevented it were too intoxicated by past victories to hear the warnings of the present. Every general, every leader, every organization that has ever believed its early success was proof of permanent invulnerability has eventually stood in the same place, staring at a map that no longer makes sense, wondering where the certainty went. Germany did not lose because it was outfought from the first moment. It lost because it outfought itself, because its own success taught it the one lesson that was going to destroy it, that consequences apply to everyone else. We started this story with an image. The most powerful military force on the planet, racing toward a wall it couldn't see because it was moving too fast to look. This is where we find out what was on the other side of that wall. Not defeat. Not immediately. But the beginning of the long, grinding, 2.5-year journey from Stalingrad to Berlin. The beginning of the reversal that would not stop. The beginning of the payment for every dismissed warning, every ignored logistics report, every general who raised his hand in concern and was told to sit down because the Führer knew better. The wall was always there. The logistics officers saw it. The generals saw it. The planners who ran the war games saw it. The wall was always real. The only thing that changed was that eventually, reality stopped waiting politely for Germany to acknowledge it. And by then, it was too late. 300,000 men at Stalingrad. 27 million Soviet dead before the war was over. 60 million human beings lost to the global catastrophe that began when one power convinced itself that its early momentum was the same thing as permanent superiority. That is the real cost of overconfidence. Not the battles lost. The lives spent. If you made it to the end of this story, something in it reached you. Maybe it was the men freezing 20 miles from Moscow with no winter coats. Maybe it was Paulus, who had predicted this exact disaster in a war game years before he lived it. Maybe it was simply the scale of it, the staggering, tragic, world-altering scale of what happens when warning is replaced by certainty. Whatever brought you to this moment, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. What moment in this story hit you hardest? What piece of this history did you not know before today? This community is built by people who believe that the past has things to teach us that go far beyond the dates and battles, and every comment you leave helps this story reach someone else who needs to hear it. If this was the kind of history that makes you lean forward in your seat, that makes the past feel alive and urgent and real, then subscribe. There are more stories waiting, stories of decisions made in pressure, of leaders who saw clearly and leaders who refused to, of moments where the world hung on a single choice. Every one of them is as real, as human, and as devastating as this one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel the weight of those winter nights on the Eastern Front, hit that like button. It costs you nothing. It means everything for keeping this channel going. The history is waiting. Don't miss what comes next.